The snow whispered beneath Elias's boots as he trudged through the wilderness, the weight of his heart heavier than the frost-clad trees surrounding him. The chill of winter had always been easier to bear than the isolation that gripped his soul. A widower, Elias had spent the past 5 years raising his young daughter, Isabel, alone. The small cabin they called home was a quiet place where laughter used to echo, but now it only seemed to amplify the silence of loss. Every step he took in the snow felt like an endless march through the past, each one dragging him further from the love he had once known and closer to the hollowness he couldn't escape. Then, just when he thought he couldn't walk any farther, something shifted in the air. A voice, faint but unmistakable, called out to him only that seemed too real to be a figment of his imagination. It led him deeper into the pines, where the world stood still, and there, lying shackled to a tree, was a woman. She wore a wedding gown, its once white fabric now stained and torn, as though the chains that bound her were the remnants of some brutal fate. Her name was Liana, and she had been left to die alone. The moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. She was broken, yet in her pain, Elias saw a reflection of his own. For the first time in years, the walls around his heart began to crumble. But Liana was not just a woman to be saved. She was a mirror to his own suffering. As her broken whispers filled the cold air, Elias's life was changed forever, for in her eyes, he saw a chance not just for redemption but for a future they could build together, far away from the darkness that had held them both captive. Now, Elias must face the choice to protect this fragile woman, who had once been a bride but was now a prisoner of her past. Together, they must escape the chains that bound them both, chains of grief, chains of fear, and chains of a world that wanted to keep them broken. But in the forest's quiet shadows, there is one truth that calls louder than the wind. The only way forward is together. The winter had come early that year, an unforgiving blanket of snow that settled on the earth like a heavy sigh. Elias trudged through the cold, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, his breath a visible mist in the air. The wind howled through the barren trees, but he didn't feel it. He hadn't felt much of anything for a long time. He kept his head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, as if the rhythm of his movement might somehow dull the sharp ache in his chest. He had spent 5 years alone, 5 long, bitter years since his wife, Emily, had passed away. 5 years of raising his daughter, Isabel, alone in the quiet cabin they once called home. The days stretched long, their endless monotony only interrupted by the routine tasks of survival in the wilderness. He had learned to take solace in the silence, to let the weight of his grief settle in the stillness. But some days, like today, the quiet seemed unbearable. Elias didn't mind the cold. In fact, it had become a friend of sorts over the years, offering a distraction from the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. His thoughts were full of memories of the warmth of Emily's laugh, the light in her eyes as she held Isabel in her arms, the way the three of them would sit by the fire after a long day. Their lives simple but full of love, but those memories had become ghosts, fading more with each passing year. And with the ghosts came the loneliness, the isolation, the ache in his heart that no amount of time seemed to ease. Isabel was a blessing, a beautiful little girl with her mother's smile and her father's quiet demeanor. But no matter how much he loved her, no matter how hard he tried to be both mother and father to her, it wasn't enough. She deserved more than the hushed, lonely life they had built for themselves. Elias could see it in the way she looked out the window, her eyes longing for something more, for someone to share the world with her, someone to fill the space where Emily used to be. He couldn't give her that. He wasn't sure he knew how. He had promised Emily, just before she passed, that he would take care of Isabel, that he would protect her and raise her right. But that promise felt heavy now, a burden that threatened to crush him under its weight. He had tried. Oh, how he had tried. But there were days when he wasn't sure he could carry it any longer. Days when the weight of his grief felt like it might swallow him whole. And that was why he was here, alone in the woods, walking as far away from the cabin as he could. He needed space. He needed time to think, to breathe. to feel something other than the crushing sadness that had defined his existence for so long. The snow fell gently around him, each flake a tiny reminder of the beauty that still existed in the world, even if it felt like it was slipping away from him. He looked up at the sky, a pale gray expanse that seemed endless, the clouds swirling and shifting like ghosts. He had always found peace in the vastness of the wilderness, the quiet majesty of the mountains that surrounded their home. It was in this place that he had once found refuge from the world, but now even the trees seemed to stand as silent witnesses to his sorrow. Solitude was a double-edged sword. It offered him refuge, yes, but it also reminded him of everything he had lost. It was hard to move forward when you felt like the past was holding you back, anchoring you in a place you couldn't escape. That's why he walked, head down, the rhythm of his steps steady but slow, as if the act of walking could somehow carry him away from the weight of his thoughts. But it didn't. The ache remained, gnawing at him, relentless. He reached the edge of the forest, the trees thinning out and giving way to a wide clearing. The snow stretched out before him, a pristine expanse of white that seemed to go on forever. It was beautiful, in its own way, but there was something about the stillness of the place that felt unnerving, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He paused, looking around, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The woods had always been silent, but today they seemed to hum with a quiet tension, a sense that something was waiting. He shook his head, trying to clear the unease from his mind, but the feeling lingered, hovering just out of reach, like a distant memory he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until the wind shifted that he heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the howl of the storm, a whisper. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time. A voice that sounded so human, so fragile, that it made his heart skip a beat. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape. There, in the distance, beyond the trees, something moved. He squinted, straining to make it out, but the snow was falling too heavily. And yet, the sound of the voice's soft, broken pulled him forward. It was a cry for help, a sound so fragile and full of pain that Elias couldn't ignore it. Without thinking, he began walking toward the source of the voice, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold no longer mattered. The ache in his chest no longer mattered. All that mattered was finding the person who had called out to him, the person who, for reasons he couldn't explain, seemed to need him. The snowflakes danced around him as he pressed on, the voice growing louder, clearer, until it became the only thing he could hear. The world around him fell away, leaving only the whisper of the wind, the crunch of his boots in the snow, and the pull of something deeper than he could understand. The wind howled around Elias, biting at his skin and numbing his fingers, but still he pressed forward, driven by an unknown force. His heart beat faster with each step, as though it could sense the urgency of the voice, calling him from the depths of the forest. The snow was thick now, a curtain that obscured everything in its path, but Elias didn't stop. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of the sound he'd heard. It was a whisper, faint but clear enough to draw him in, a whisper that carried with it an unmistakable sense of pain. He pushed through the snowdrifts, his boots sinking into the deep drifts with each step, but still, the voice was there, pulling him closer. He tried to steady his breath, but the cold air burned his lungs, making it hard to focus. He wasn't sure how far he had walked, but the further he went, the more the world around him seemed to shrink, as if he were moving deeper into some kind of forgotten space where time had no meaning. The trees closed in on him, their twisted branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, just as he thought he might lose his bearings completely, he saw it. Through the swirling snow, a shape-hand, indistinct figure appeared before him, half hidden by the thick fog of falling snowflakes. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he pushed through the final barrier of trees and came upon a clearing. There, in the center, chained to a lone tree, was a woman. Her figure was small, fragile-looking, her skin pale beneath the thin fabric of what appeared to be a tattered wedding gown. Her dark hair was matted with snow, and her hands, bound tightly by heavy iron chains, rested against the trunk of the tree. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Her lips parted, and in the stillness of the snow-covered world, Elias heard it again, the broken whisper that had called him here. "Help me," she breathed, her voice barely audible, but unmistakably real. Elias's heart thundered in his chest as he took a step forward, his mind racing to understand what he was seeing. He had heard stories of things like this, of people left to die in the wilds, but he had never imagined he would find someone in such a dire state. He couldn't just stand there. He had to act. He moved toward her, the chains that bound her rattling in the silence as he knelt down beside her. "Who did this to you?" Elias asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. She met his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes were full of sorrow, of pain, but there was something else there too, something Elias couldn't quite name. "My name is Liana," she whispered, her voice trembling, "and I was left here to die." Elias's heart lurched as he looked at her, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this to her? Why? And most importantly, how could he help her? But at that moment, all he could do was act. He reached out, gently pulling at the chains that bound her, his hands shaking as he tried to free her. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for certain. This woman, Liana, was not going to die here, alone in the snow. And with that thought, Elias's journey into the unknown had truly begun. Elias worked quickly, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the chains. The iron was cold, too cold to touch for long, but he didn't hesitate. Each rattle of the shackles as he pulled at them sent a sharp pang through his chest. She was real, she was here, and she was in need of him, just as much as he had once needed someone. The snow continued to fall around them, heavy and unrelenting, but Elias barely noticed it. The only thing that mattered was the woman before him, bound by chains, her fragile form trembling from both the cold and the torment she had endured. Liana's eyes were fixed on him, wide and desperate, but there was something in them that pulled him in a quiet strength, a flicker of resilience that refused to be snuffed out, even in the face of such suffering. The more he worked at the chains, the more he realized how deeply she had been hurt. The cuffs that bound her were heavy, worn with age, and the metal was stained with the marks of long, unforgiving use. Whoever had done this to her hadn't just locked her away, they had tried to break her. When the last chain finally gave way, Elias helped her to her feet, his hands steady as he supported her frail body. She leaned heavily on him, and for a moment he was afraid she might collapse. Her skin was pale, her lips blue from the cold, and her body so thin that he could feel the bones beneath her delicate skin. But despite her weakness, she stood, albeit unsteadily, and she gave him a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. The words were barely audible, but they carried weight, and Elias felt a strange tightening in his chest at the sound. He had been alone for so long, his life defined by the weight of solitude. But now, standing here with this woman, he felt something stir inside him, a connection, an understanding that transcended words. "Don't know who did this to you," Elias said softly, his voice trembling with the urgency of the moment. "But we need to get you out of here. You're safe now." Liana's eyes flickered with pain as she looked up at him, but she nodded once more, her face a mask of exhaustion. Elias wanted to say more, wanted to ask her about her past, her story, but the words wouldn't come. The journey back to his cabin would be treacherous, and they had no time to waste. The storm was worsening, the wind whipping through the trees with increasing intensity, and the world around them was quickly becoming a blur of white. "Can you walk?" Elias asked, his voice softer now, as he supported her weight, keeping her close as they made their way back toward the safety of his cabin. She nodded again, her legs shaky but determined. Elias helped her through the snow, their footsteps leaving a trail in the freshly fallen powder. With every step, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The wind seemed to whisper, the trees shifting and groaning in the storm, and Elias's instincts screamed that they were not alone. But when he looked around, there was nothing just. The empty vastness of the wilderness, the oppressive silence broken only by the howling wind. He kept moving, determined to get Liana to safety, but with each passing moment, the feeling of being followed grew stronger, and then, through the storm, the distant sound of hooves reached his ears. It was faint at first, just a whisper over the wind, but it was unmistakable. Someone was coming. Elias's heart raced as he pulled Liana closer, his pace quickening. They had to make it to the cabin. They had to be safe. By the time they reached the cabin, Elias's legs ached from the cold and the effort of carrying Liana through the snow. Isabel was still inside, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Elias had hoped to keep it that way, but now, as the door creaked open and they stumbled inside, a heavy silence filled the room. "Papa?" Isabel's voice called from the hearth, where she had been sitting by the fire. The little girl looked up from her book, her bright eyes filled with curiosity as she took in the sight of the stranger leaning on her father. Her gaze flickered between Elias and Liana, the confusion on her face quickly giving way to concern. "Who is she?" Elias stepped inside, gently easing Liana onto the couch by the fire. He quickly covered her with a thick blanket, but his mind was racing. How would he explain this? What could he possibly say? "She's a guest, Isabel," Elias said quietly, trying to sound reassuring. "She's been through a lot, and we need to help her." Isabel nodded, her innocent gaze taking in the woman before her. Liana met her eyes, offering a faint, weary smile in return. Isabel didn't ask any more questions, but Elias could see the curiosity burning in her eyes. She was too young to understand the complexities of the world, but the way she watched Liana with that soft, open expression made Elias's heart ache. Liana was still shivering, her teeth chattering despite the warmth of the fire. Elias moved quickly, fetching a cup of warm tea from the stove and bringing it to her. "Drink this," he urged gently. "It will help." Liana accepted the tea, her hands shaking slightly as she raised the cup to her lips. Her gaze never left him as she drank, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Elias felt the weight of her silence pressing down on him. She was clearly a woman in pain, physically and emotionally, but she had yet to speak of what had happened to her. And Elias, though he longed to know, knew better than to press too soon. After a long moment, Liana put the cup down and took a slow, shaky breath. "My name is Liana," she began, her voice hoarse from lack of use. I was married once." Elias sat down beside her, his mind racing as he listened to her words. There was something in her eyes, something that told him her past wasn't as simple as it seemed. "Married?" Elias asked gently, his brow furrowing as he tried to understand. She nodded, her eyes distant, as if lost in some faraway memory. "I was promised to a man from a wealthy family. I had no choice in the matter. The marriage was. It wasn't a marriage. It was a contract, a transaction." Elias's heart sank as he listened to her, the words settling like a heavy weight in his chest. He had heard of such things, forced marriages, women treated as nothing more than property, but hearing Liana's story brought it all into sharper focus. She had been a bride, but not in the way anyone should have been. "I tried to leave him," Liana continued, her voice breaking. "But he found me, and he didn't just take me back. She trailed off, her eyes welling with tears as the memory of her torment came flooding back. "He left me to die." Elias didn't know what to say. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers, offering her what little warmth he could. The silence between them stretched, heavy and fraught with understanding. She had been broken, left to the mercy of the cold, the chains that had bound her. But here, in this cabin, Elias knew he would do everything in his power to protect her. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the room apart from the occasional gust of wind against the windows. The storm had intensified outside, the snow now falling in thick sheets, coating the landscape in an impenetrable white shroud. Inside, though, there was a fragile sense of safety, a brief respite from the chaos of the world outside. Liana sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the flames. Her body was still weak from the cold, her muscles aching from the ordeal of being chained and left in the wilderness. But her mind seemed to be elsewhere, lost in the fog of her memories. Elias watched her from across the room, his mind heavy with the weight of her story. The more she spoke, the more he understood how deeply she had been betrayed, how cruelly her life had been stripped of agency and choice. He had been alone for so long, and the idea of someone else's suffering felt unbearable to him. He had once lost everything, his wife, his peace, his sense of self, but Liana's pain seemed to cut deeper, somehow, as if the world had conspired against her in ways Elias could scarcely fathom. He wanted to help her, to ease her pain, but what could he do? He could give her shelter, offer her warmth and food, but that would never be enough to undo the scars of her past. How could he possibly heal the wounds that ran so deep within her? Liana's eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, she seemed to read the thoughts running through his mind. She gave him a small, sad smile. "You don't have to fix me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I'm beyond fixing." Elias's heart broke at the sound of her words. He wanted to deny them, to tell her that she wasn't beyond repair, but he knew deep down that there were some wounds that could never fully heal. There were some things that could never be undone, but that didn't mean he wouldn't try. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "No one should have to endure what you've been through, and no one should be left to die like that." Liana's gaze softened, and she reached out to take his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frailty. "Thank you for saving me," she said quietly. "But the man who left me, who chained me, he's not just going to let me go." Elias nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The man who had done this to her would not stop until he had her back. But Elias would not let that happen, not on his watch. Whatever it took, he would protect her. He had made that promise to Emily, and he would honor it now. "We'll figure something out," Elias said, his voice filled with resolve. "You don't have to face him alone. Not anymore." And as Liana looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear, Elias knew that the battle was just beginning. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was an uneasy stillness. Elias had never been one for idle conversation. He preferred the quiet, the simplicity of his days spent alone with Isabel. But now, with Liana in his care, the silence felt heavier, as if it were waiting for something to break it. He moved around the cabin, making sure there was enough wood to last through the night, his mind racing with thoughts of what had happened, what was to come. Liana sat by the fire, her eyes dull from exhaustion, her body weak but gradually warming. She had refused to sleep, too afraid of what the night might bring, so instead, she sat quietly, her hands wrapped around the warm mug of tea Elias had given her. She was a mystery to him, this woman who had been betrayed by the world, abandoned in the snow like a broken thing. The more he looked at her, the more he saw the signs of a past that was far darker than he could ever have imagined. And yet, in spite of it all, there was something about her, something unyielding. The flicker of resilience in her eyes. It reminded him of Isabel's quiet strength, that same ability to carry on even when everything seemed lost. Elias had expected to be overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for someone like Liana, but in truth, it was different. The weight of her presence, the understanding that she had been through unimaginable pain, only deepened his resolve. He had been a father for years, but caring for Isabel was a role he had grown into, not chosen. This was different. With Liana, he wasn't just offering shelter from the cold. He wasn't just tending to her wounds. No, he was giving her something far more important, a second chance. A glimpse at the life she had once dreamed of before the chains had bound her. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about hope. Isabel watched the woman cautiously, her small hands nervously twisting the hem of her dress. The little girl had always been observant, her silent curiosity making her more aware of things than most children her age. Elias could see the questions in her eyes, could sense the confusion that had come from seeing her father bring a stranger into their home. He couldn't offer her all the answers, not yet. Not when Liana's story was still unfolding, still shrouded in mystery. But he did his best to reassure her, pulling her close and whispering a quiet promise. "Don't worry, Isabel, she's safe here." As the evening stretched on, Elias stayed close to Liana, helping her settle in by the fire. He had hoped for a peaceful night, a moment of quiet after the storm. But as the hours passed, he began to notice something strange. Liana's movements were slow, deliberate, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety in the way she looked around the room, her eyes darting nervously to the door. She had been through so much already, and Elias could sense that she wasn't just scared of the storm outside, there was something else haunting her. "Liana," he asked gently, sitting beside her on the couch, "what is it? What's really troubling you?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. "I can't stay here forever," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man who left me out there, he'll come looking for me. He won't stop." Elias frowned, his heart tightening at the thought of her being pursued, hunted like some wild animal. "We'll figure something out. He won't find you. Not here." "But," Liana shook her head, the sorrow in her eyes deepening. "You don't understand," she said, her voice strained. "He's a powerful man, Elias. His reach is far, and he won't stop until I'm back with him, under his control." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Elias could see the fear in her eyes, the terror that still gripped her, even now, in the safety of his cabin. The reality of her situation was settling in, and Elias knew that no matter how far they ran, no matter how much he tried to protect her, they would eventually have to face the man who had torn her life apart. But Elias wasn't one to run from a fight. Not anymore. He had a daughter to protect, and now he had a woman who needed him too. He would not let this man take Liana from him, not after everything they had been through together. The fire crackled louder in the silence, and as Elias stared at the flames, he knew that his life was no longer just about survival. It was about something much more important, fighting for those who needed him, for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The days that followed were a blur of routine: chopping wood, gathering food, and caring for Liana as she slowly regained some strength. Elias had hoped the worst was behind them, but the days passed in a strange, unsettling quiet. Liana was starting to trust him, starting to settle into the rhythms of their little cabin. Yet, despite the outward calm, something lingered in the air, a heavy tension that neither of them could shake. Elias found himself looking at her more and more, not just as the woman he had rescued from the snow, but as a person, a soul with her own story, her own pain. She was beginning to open up to him, bit by bit, and each revelation was more harrowing than the last. She had been a prisoner, bound by the expectations of a family who had treated her as little more than a pawn in their game of wealth and power. Her marriage had been a cage, her love a fantasy that had never been allowed to exist. And now, here she was, a stranger in a strange place, slowly finding herself again. As the days passed, Elias couldn't help but feel the pull of something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time: a connection. The more he learned about her, the more he saw in Liana the same quiet strength he had seen in Emily. It was a bond that formed without either of them realizing it, built not just on their shared solitude, but on the unspoken understanding of loss, of betrayal, of survival. They were both scarred, both broken, but together, in this quiet, secluded cabin, they were slowly beginning to heal. For the first time in years, Elias found himself smiling again, not just for Isabel, but for himself. He had been so focused on surviving, on keeping his promise to Emily, that he had forgotten what it meant to live, to connect, to hope. But Liana was teaching him that hope could still exist, even in the darkest of times. She, too, was starting to feel it, the slow, hesitant warmth of a new beginning. There was a moment one evening when she laughed, a soft, unexpected sound that echoed in the small cabin. Elias had told a joke, one that was so ridiculous that it caught her off guard. Her laugh was like the first rays of sunlight after a storm, And in that moment, Elias realized that he had been waiting for that sound, waiting for the moment when life, in all its brokenness, would begin to feel whole again. But despite the fragile hope that was growing between them, there was an undercurrent of fear that neither of them could ignore. Liana's past was never far from her mind, and the shadow of the man who had trapped her still loomed over them. She could no longer hide from the reality of the danger they faced. Elias could see it in her eyes, the way she would sometimes grow distant, lost in the memories of a life she was trying to escape. And as much as he wanted to protect her, he knew that no matter how much he cared for her, there were some things that could not be outrun. The moment Liana had spoken of her past, the cruel man who had locked her away had made it clear that their time in the cabin was limited. They would have to leave soon, whether they were ready or not. And when they did, they would have to face the storm that awaited them outside, the storm that Liana had tried so desperately to escape. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. For now, days turned into weeks, and the storm outside seemed to match the turmoil in Liana's heart. Though Elias's cabin had become a safe haven, a place of warmth and relative peace, Liana knew the danger wasn't over. The man who had locked her in chains, the man who had once been her husband, was still out there, and he was coming for her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm she had fled from would soon catch up with her, but something had shifted within her during her time with Elias. The terror that had consumed her since she escaped had begun to fade, replaced by a small, flickering light of hope. Elias had given her something she had thought was lost forever, a glimpse of a life she could have, a life where she wasn't just a victim, a pawn in someone else's game. Liana knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that their peace wouldn't last forever. But she also knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, thickening with every hour, blurring the world outside into a white haze. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire fought back the encroaching cold, but Elias couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just the uncertainty in the air, the quiet tension that lingered between him and Liana. It was something more, a presence, a weight he could not name. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm, and it gnawed at him. Then, one evening, as the wind howled louder than it ever had before, a knock came at the door, soft at first, a tap-tap, barely a whisper against the bluster of the storm. Elias froze, the suddenness of it startling him. He had no visitors, no one had come to this remote place in years. His hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt, and he moved quietly toward the door, peering through the crack of the wooden frame. Outside, through the swirling snow, Elias could barely make out the silhouette of a man, a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone who had spent their life in control. Elias's heart skipped a beat. This was no lost traveler seeking shelter. This was the hunter, the man who had owned Liana, the one who had bound her to a life of torment. The realization hit Elias like a thunderclap, and without thinking, he pulled the door open just enough to address the intruder. "What do you want?" Elias's voice was cold, but beneath it, there was an unmistakable undertone of warning. The man on the other side smiled, a tight, cruel grin that didn't reach his eyes. His voice was smooth, like the calm before an avalanche. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his gaze flickering over Elias, then past him, into the dimly lit cabin. "A woman. She's been rather elusive." Elias stiffened, instinctively stepping into the doorway to block the man's view of the interior. "You'll find no one here," he said firmly, the knife at his side feeling more like an anchor than a weapon. But the man didn't seem threatened. Instead, he gave a low chuckle, as if Elias's bravado was amusing. "I think we both know that's not true," he said. "I can smell the fear in the air, and I know she's here." Elias stood his ground. "She's not going anywhere with you, not while I'm here." The man's eyes narrowed, his grin fading into something colder, sharper. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you? I'll give you one chance, Elias. Step aside, and I'll let you and your little girl walk away from this. Refuse, and you'll regret it." Elias knew there was no walking away from this. The man's offer was Lee would never let them go. "You'll have to kill me first." The man's eyes gleamed with malice, and for a moment the wind howled louder, as if the storm itself was holding its breath, waiting for the violence to unfold. But before anything else could be said, a sharp cry came from inside the cabin. "Isabel." Elias's heart lurched. He turned, his protective instincts surging. "Isabel, stay inside," he called over his shoulder. The hunter laughed, his voice carrying over the wind. "Your daughter? How quaint. But we both know this ends the same way, don't we?" Elias turned back to face him, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension in the air was unbearable, thick with the weight of what was about to happen. The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword at his side. But before any further threats could be exchanged, Elias made his move. The cold wind raged outside, and inside the cabin, the storm raged within Elias's chest. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fury and fear. The hunter was here, and there was no turning back. Liana was still behind him, still recovering from her ordeal, and Isabel was vulnerable. Elias had been prepared for a fight, but what he hadn't anticipated was the sheer audacity of the man standing before him. The hunter's name was Lord Aldrich. He had a reputation for cruelty, a man whose wealth and influence had made him untouchable. The chains that had bound Liana were no different from the chains he had placed on countless others, people whose lives were little more than pieces on his chessboard. But Elias knew that no matter how powerful Aldrich was, Elias would not allow him to have her note now, not ever. Elias's eyes flicked toward Liana, who was standing near the fire, her expression unreadable. He could feel the fear radiating off her. But there was something else there, too, something like resolve. She was no longer the fragile woman he had first found in the snow. She had grown stronger in the time she had spent with him, and Elias saw that strength now, burning in her eyes. She was ready to fight for her freedom. She wasn't going to let Aldrich take her again. "Elias," Liana said, her voice steady but urgent, "we can't stay here. He'll bring more men." Elias glanced at her, meeting her gaze with a silent promise. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her, not while he still had breath in his lungs. "We're not running. Not this time." Lord Aldrich stepped forward, the sound of his boots crunching against the snow outside the cabin echoing in the silence. "You don't understand, Elias. I've been patient, but my patience is running out. This ends tonight." With a sudden, fluid motion, Elias grabbed Liana's arm and pulled her behind him. He was ready. The hunter was powerful, yes, but Elias had his own strength, his will, his resolve, and his desire to protect the woman who had come to mean more to him than he could say. Then, in the blink of an eye, Elias made a decision. The only way they were going to survive this was if they left. They had to leave the cabin, leave everything behind. They would not let Aldrich take Liana. They would not let him win. Without a word, Elias turned to Liana and nodded. She understood. At that moment, they had formed a silent pact of promise to fight together, to leave this place, and to never look back. The storm outside raged with renewed fury as they made their escape, moving swiftly and silently through the cabin's back door, into the night. Aldrich's shouts echoed behind them, but Elias didn't look back. They would deal with him later. Right now, all that mattered was getting to safety. The wind whipped around them as Elias, Liana, and Isabel raced through the snow, the world around them a blur of white and gray. They had no plan, no clear idea of where they were going. All Elias knew was that they had to get as far away from the cabin as possible. The hunter Lord Aldrich was close behind, and Elias could hear the distant sound of his men's hooves pounding the frozen earth. They were relentless, but so was Elias. He pulled Liana close, offering her what little warmth he could, his heart pounding as he urged them forward. Isabel clutched his side, her small hand trembling in his. He could hear her breathing heavily, but she was strong. She had always been strong, despite her tender years. "We can't stop," Elias muttered under his breath, his voice strained with exhaustion. The cold had crept into their bones, and their breaths came in ragged gasps, but they kept moving. The storm had taken on a life of its own, the snow falling faster now, almost blinding them. Liana's face was pale, her features drawn with fatigue, but there was determination in her eyes. "Elias," she said, her voice barely audible against the howling wind, "there's a cave not far from here. We can shelter there for a while." Elias didn't hesitate. He trusted, her trusted, that she knew what she was talking about. "Lead the way," he said, his voice firm. They stumbled through the snow, Liana leading them through the swirling darkness. The world had become a maze of trees and shadows, and Elias's mind raced, his instincts on high alert. He could still hear the sounds of pursuit, but they were fading. He pushed onward, fueled by desperation and the fierce need to protect his family. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the cave. It was small but deep, a hollow in the side of a mountain, hidden from view by the thick snow and the trees that surrounded it. They huddled inside, exhausted and shivering, the cold of the night pressing in from all sides. Elias sat with his back to the cold stone, his arms around Isabel and Liana. The storm outside roared, but inside, they were safe for now. "We made it," Elias whispered, though the words felt empty. They hadn't won yet, but they survived. And in that moment, survival was enough. The night was long, filled with the sound of the storm, but by morning, the snow had settled. The world outside the cave was pristine, untouched, but Elias knew that the calm wouldn't last. Aldrich would be coming for them. They couldn't stay hidden forever. As the sun began to rise, casting pale light over the snow, Elias stood, stretching his stiff limbs. He looked down at Liana, who was still asleep, her face soft with exhaustion. Isabel was curled up beside him, her small body shaking from the cold, but her eyes were calm, as if she, too, understood the weight of what lay ahead. Elias took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying with every passing moment. They couldn't keep running. They had to face Aldrich, once and for all. And when they did, Elias would make sure it would be the last time anyone would ever try to control Lion or anyone else again. As the new day broke, Elias stepped out of the cave, his eyes scanning the horizon. The world was quiet, but he knew that things were about to change. For better or worse, they were no longer hiding. They were fighting back, and that was the first step toward reclaiming their lives. Together, they would build a future, a new dawning where no chains, no past, and no man would ever have the power to break them again.